In Washington state, it's illegal, it's against the Constitution to have a graduated income tax. The only type of income tax you could have here is a flat income tax at 1%. But that hasn't stopped Democrats from trying to get an income tax on the books. And one of the ways they've done that as kind of a precursor to just sort of pushing and trying to change the Constitution is they passed a tax on capital gains. And their justification was that, oh, capital gains tax is not an income tax, and we're trying to make sure the wealthy pay more of their fair share. The problem with that is that even the IRS is very clear. Capital gains is an income tax. And it doesn't seem like there's any daylight there, any room for interpretation. So anyway, Democrats passed this tax on capital gains. Obviously, there's a lawsuit. They expected it. The lawsuit's been going through the process. Well, we're waiting for the Washington State Supreme Court to make the determination here. Is a capital gains tax an income tax? But in the meantime, today, the state of Washington got the green light to continue or to start collecting a tax on capital gains, even while it is legally in jeopardy. So I asked Jason Mercier, who's the government reform director at the Washington Policy Center, to join us to talk about kind of the justification here, if you can find one, and sort of what this is really meant to be a precursor to. Because there's a lot of you who probably don't qualify for a tax on capital gains. That's not impacting you. But where Democrats are trying to take this most certainly would. Jason, welcome to Undivided. For folks who are only listening on the podcast today and not watching, they're really missing out because I deeply enjoy your virtual background.
Yeah, I had to take advantage of the fact that, even Bart Simpson can write on the chalkboard 100 times that the IRS says a capital gains tax is an income tax. And someday soon, our legislature hopefully will get that message as well.
It's very good. Okay, take it down. It's too distracting there. That's perfect. So the news today that the state is going to collect the capital gains tax while this is all pending. Does that surprise you?
This odyssey of this tax has been nothing but surprises. A stay of a tax ruling is not unusual, but that usually happens at the time a court issues a decision. Right. And this decision was made back on March 1st. And some people are painting this as judge shopping, that the plaintiffs went and found a sympathetic judge. This judge was appointed by Governor Inslee. This is an Inslee appointed judge in Douglas County who back on March 1st ruled as everybody expected. And in fact, we actually have public records from the Speaker of the House and from the sponsor of this in the House saying they weren't surprised by the fact that this judge ruled the tax unconstitutional, illegal, void, invalid, inoperable, because for 100 years, everybody's known the rules of the game. Income is property, and a graduated income tax requires a constitutional amendment. So that was not a surprise. What was, I guess, disappointing about where we are today, the Attorney General did not ask a stay. That ruling went into effect back on March 1st, full force, which led to the question, what is the Department of Revenue going to do? Are they going to try to collect a tax that has been invalidated? And we were asking them, we asked in March, in April, in May, in June, all the way up to last month, Department of Revenue, what are your plans? Are you going to try to collect an unconstitutional tax? And the answer I always got was that decision has not been made yet. There is still time to decide that, which is problematic. The answer is pretty simple. No, we will not collect the tax unless we have authority from a higher court. And that's where we come to full circle today. It wasn't back in March that the Attorney General tried to stop this. It was just a few weeks ago. He went directly to the Supreme Court. And from what I've been told, it's highly unusual, if not unprecedented, to wait 8 months between a ruling and going and asking for a stay request. But that's what the state did. And today, the Attorney General got the green light unanimously from the Supreme Court for the Department of Revenue to collect this brand new income tax before the court renders a final decision on it.
So what is your understanding if they've said, as they collect the money, and if ultimately the Supreme Court does not decide in their favor, will the money just sit in an account somewhere and be given back, or what?
Yeah, this is one of the entertaining things of the Attorney General's motion for a stay. He said that it would be in the interest of these taxpayers, it would be in the interest of those subject to this tax to pay it now So just in case the Supreme Court decides to uphold it, they wouldn't owe penalties and interest, which is a little, nobody was asking for this favor to begin with. But it's very true that the bill the legislature passed had a penalty scheme, right? If you didn't submit your income tax returns to the state of Washington on time, you didn't pay the 7% on time, you would owe penalties and interest. So it's true that that was in the bill they passed, but you have to realize that's what was invalidated by the trial court, right? The entire thing went away. So if down the road the Supreme Court were to decide, no, this is a legal tax, they have some discretion. They could have decided, well, we're changing the understanding of this that's been in place since it was invalidated by the trial court. So we're going to forego those penalties and interest and just no harm, no foul. But that was the argument from the Attorney General. So where we are now, let's say that we're right and the IRS is right and every other state in the country is right that this is an income tax, and the Supreme Court decides that as well. Now these taxpayers are going to have gone through the effort for the very first time, filing their income tax in the state of Washington, paying this tax, and then going back and asking for refunds.
You got to love the government saying, oh, it's in your interest to give us money. We'll give it back. We promise. If it comes down to that, it's just, you can't make this stuff up sometimes.
Well, and this is where the Department of Revenue was arguing, as it was refusing to just directly answer my question on what its plans were. It went through formal rulemaking. And they were telling the taxpayers as they went through this rulemaking, don't worry, we are doing you a favor. This is just guidance in case the Supreme Court later decides we can collect this tax, which again is problematic from the standpoint of if the law is invalidated, there is no authority to go through this rulemaking. And again, there was no stay. No stay was in effect from March 1st until November 30th. Yet the state of Washington was moving forward as if that lower court ruling never occurred. And this is where you saw an outside legal firm, the Citizen Action Defense Fund, actually got involved a few months ago and sent the Department of Revenue a cease and desist letter saying you have no authority to be doing this. This was invalidated. This ruling's in full force and effect. This entity also went to what's called the Joint Legislative Administrative Review Committee. It's the legislative committee that oversees agencies to make sure they're compliant with rulemaking. And to this agency's credit, it's a bipartisan committee. They sent the Department of Revenue a letter saying, if you're going to go forward with this, you have to actually put in the rules that this is just guidance. It doesn't take effect until the court says otherwise. Unfortunately, now that is all moot because today, unanimously, the state Supreme Court told the Department of Revenue, go ahead and collect this brand new income tax before we make a final decision.
Should that foreshadow, or does that foreshadow what the state Supreme Court's ultimate ruling on this might be?
Obviously, you would have preferred that not to have happened if you're an opponent of this tax, but it's really hard to read into it because, again, nothing about this is normal, right? The state of Washington saying that we have discovered a brand new way to tax capital gains that nobody in the world is aware of, that's not normal, right? Using an emergency clause to prohibit the citizens' right of referendum on a tax that at the time wouldn't take effect for 2 years, that's not normal. Waiting 8 months to request a stay of a ruling on the eve of taxpayers trying to decide whether or not they're going to be subject to this tax, that's not normal. So it's really hard to say, are the justices giving an indication of where they're going to rule on this? Those that support this tax are making that claim. They're out there right now. I just saw a funny post attacking me saying that I failed in my attempt to brand this an income tax. Well, I must be all powerful because it's the IRS. It's 49 other states and it's other countries in the world. But we'll see soon enough whether or not our Supreme Court has decided that Washington is so unique that it alone knows the way to tax capital gains.
And just for folks who are like, well, I'm not subject to a capital gains tax anyway, why do I care? Do you still believe that this is a precursor for them trying to do a full-fledged income tax?
Don't take my word for it. Let's take the words of the lawmakers that passed this. We have public records from the Democratic lawmakers that passed this, who said the entire purpose of this was not to tax capital gains, right? Capital gains are extremely volatile. When you hear about volatility in California's budget, that's not driven by wage income, that's driven by capital gains income. And this is why states try to move away from that. So what was the purpose? Why did Washington do this? Well, we have the public records that say that they knew if they passed this, they would be sued. So they got their wish there. And they wanted to be sued because they are under the impression that this current Supreme Court will do differently than the prior Supreme Courts. Because for 100 years, the Supreme Court has said that Washingtonians own their income. Makes sense. Well, if you own your income, it's property, and that means you can't be taxed at more than 1%, and it has to be uniform. So people sometimes say that an income tax is unconstitutional in Washington. It's not. You can have a flat 1% income tax. You can't have what they passed, 7% with a non-uniform base. And what the hope of all of this was that they go to the court and the Supreme Court says, you know what? For 100 years, we were wrong. You actually don't own your income. And then the legislature can come back and pass a broad-based graduated income tax without a constitutional amendment. And that matters because Washingtonians have already rejected 6 of those, which leads me to my favorite ruling from the state Supreme Court. It was 1 page in 1960, and it basically said, stop asking us. We're not changing our minds. If you want a graduated income tax, amend the Constitution.
I love it. And maybe I'm naive for asking this, but you're the expert on this. Why doesn't the legislature just pass a 1% tax on income?
That's the mystery, right? They have always had the ability to do a flat 1% income tax. But I think the reason why that hasn't happened is everybody would pay it. You can't carve out anybody because to comply with the Constitution, it has to be uniformly applied.
And so their idea being that, because they believe that our tax system is regressive. And so if they just did 1%, they're adding taxes to kind of low income people without taking any taxes away. Like they'd feel pressure to take away the gas tax or something.
Well, and that's the curious thing about this, because if you recall, one of the reasons why they said we needed to pass this capital gains income tax was because the low income were paying too much and the wealthy not enough. So what tax did they cut when they passed this? None. Right? The original version of the bill actually had a taxpayer relief account where they were going to put some of the money for some undefined future tax relief. It's kind of like the Popeye, I'll gladly give you tax relief on Tuesday for an income tax today, right? But they pulled that from the final bill. So all we got was a new tax with no reduction. And that's unfortunately the way taxes usually go. You don't see them go the other way, which is why Washingtonians keep rejecting these because they don't trust the legislature.
Yeah, it's a good point. If low income are overtaxed, you haven't done anything to solve that. You're just taxing wealthier people more, and low income people are still suffering with egregious taxes. Jason, always a pleasure to talk to you about this. Thanks for joining us from DC, where you're doing what?
I'm actually talking about taxes in DC. I'm all the way across the country to have a ruling in Washington State.
Nerd, tax nerd. Jason, thanks for being here.
Great, thank you.
You gotta love the argument from the government though, like, oh, let's just hold on to your money. It'll be better for you in the long run. And we'll for sure give it back to you if we end up not being able to keep it. It's like, and again, we just go back to that first story I talked about today, just government incompetence and ineptitude. This is a prime example of it. How freaking complicated is that? It's like, instead of just putting everything on pause, right, until this can be sorted out, you knew you were gonna get sued over it. So just let the process run its course. But no, instead of doing that, you've got to ask the Supreme Court, hey, can we keep collecting this? Can we start collecting this tax? You've got to start collecting it. People who are going to pay it have to deal with all of that on their end. And then someplace down the road, you might have to give it all back. And then you got to go through the whole process of giving it all back. It's like the government always finds the most freaking complicated way to do things. It's unreal to me. And also, beyond all that, you don't need any more money. The state is in a fine place financially. And Jason made a good point there that, okay, if your argument is the poor in our state are taxed too heavily compared to the rich, you haven't done anything to take taxes away, to take the tax burden, to relieve the tax burden on the poor. You've just added to the tax burden of the rich. So you're not helping low-income individuals. You're making it sound an awful lot like you are. You're not doing anything to help low-income individuals who are buried in taxes. You're just adding taxes. You're just taking more money from the rich. And people just let Democrats continually get away with this stuff, and they're the only party that has any power in Washington state. And they're just, as long as people don't push back against this just relentless taking of taxpayer funds, and then what do we have to show for it? Worsening homeless crisis, worsening crime. Obviously a mental health system that's in complete shambles, unaffordable housing, shit roads. I mean, Jesus, the roads, snowstorm today. I was driving on a major highway. You got a couple inches of snow, couldn't clear it. If you show me a government that is running a tight ship, that's having great outcomes, and you come and you say, hey, we need more money, that's a totally different story. But the government that we currently have in Olympia has not proven that it needs any more money, be it from poor people or from rich people.